Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Küstenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our futures. Today, we're going to be exploring a topic that's often discussed, but frequently misunderstood: generational research. Generations, boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z. We hear these terms tossed around all the time, often accompanied by sweeping generalizations about their attitudes, their behavior, and their lifestyle. But how much of what we hear is accurate? How much is just noise? Now, whether you're a business leader, a policymaker, or just curious about the forces shaping our society, this conversation and the series of generational videos we're about to now produce each week as we go through each of those generations is really going to be very valuable for you. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Michael. One of my favorite topics to discuss, by the way.
Yes, definitely. Well, as I said, it's the beginning of the series of these weekly episodes about the different generations. I think this is going to be valuable for employers to understand their team members. It's going to be invaluable for employees to understand those who they work with or how their bosses think. It's going to be critical for business people to understand. They should understand what their clients, their customers are thinking, who they are, what drives them. And it'll also be valuable for property investors, in my mind, to understand the needs of the different generations for whom they're providing a service, they're providing accommodation. But Simon, before we break down each of the generations individually in the future episodes, I know you've written an article in the New Daily, you write regularly in the New Daily that people can read your musings, and in the Australian as well, but you wrote about generational research. So I'm looking forward to unpacking that a bit. So let's understand a bit about generational research. What is it?
Well, yes, so it's the study of people, of generational values, and it's the idea that somehow there is a collective kind of worldview that gets stuck with you as a birth cohort, and then as we move through the ages and a new generation enters the life cycle, somehow those folks think a tiny bit different, and the next generation thinks different, the next generation thinks different. It's quite bizarre how much of this is really happening. And that, of course, then becomes important because there is potential for intergenerational conflict, misunderstandings. But it's also, from a marketing perspective, an opportunity for you to actually speak the language of the cohort that you want to target with your material.
They really do speak different languages. So even though I speak a bit of German, I know it's your mother tongue because my mother was from Austria. When I go to Germany, I can get understood, but I don't get the nuances. I don't really get what people are saying. And I think it's much the same when different generations don't get each other.
Exactly. And then we'll come to kind of fun stereotypes that, of course, now in the age of the meme gets blown up, and then we kind of stuck with this. And we'll be using an awful lot of generalizations, by the way, in the coming weeks when we talk about generations. But that is part of the idea. So the general idea behind generational research is that the time in your formative years, roughly your teenage years to your early 20s, they shape you in a lasting way. That means the geopolitical environment under which you grow up, the economic environment under which you enter the workforce for the first time, the technological environment, the social topics that are being discussed, these things stick with you. And they then shape your outlook forever. While it occurs, when we now look
sorry to interrupt you, Simon. At a subconscious level, you don't recognize this.
Exactly. You don't recognize it because this is your worldview as you grow up. So this is the right and correct worldview. And you assume that because you lived through it and the other people that were alive at the same time, they lived through it too, that they must have taken the same lessons or behaviors from it. And that is not the case. You can, for example, take the pandemic, which, we both live in Melbourne, a city that was under severe lockdowns. But you and I, we were much too old already when the pandemic occurred to be impacted in a lasting way, meaning our worldviews did not change. We might have been annoyed by it, impacted. We might have, had our businesses impacted by it, but it was not a lasting impact. Whereas the kids that went to school, to early university years at that time, their worldviews are permanently shaped by that, and we're yet to find out in what way and form that would have really impacted them. But so we take all of this together, and then that's roughly generational research. And when you look at generations to begin with, the big question always is, hey, what generation am I part of? And sometimes this is harder to say than you might think, because there are two main approaches of deciding what generation you belong to. The first one is it's a social approach where you carefully measure nuances in society to figure out this is really where a shift occurs, and we then set a new generational marker. And in this approach, you end up with some generations being assigned 21 birth years, whereas other generations only get 13 birth years. And that's fine if you take broad social markers as the topic, but that makes all numerical work with generational data kind of meaningless. Because these cohorts don't live through the housing stages, for example. So you roughly rent, or you roughly live with your parents until you're in your early 20s, and then you rent for a bit, and that doesn't make sense if a cohort is only 13 years, for example. So what I prefer in my data, and these would be the years that I would be referring to, would be the cohort approach. That's where every 18 years, we assign a new name to a generation, and that then makes sense then to say, well, this generation is so much bigger or so much smaller than the other generation. Certain things flow from that. And within all generational research, doesn't matter what approach you take, the baby boomers are the marker, because after the end of the Second World War, we saw across the whole developed Western world, not in India, not in China, for example, not in most of the countries that were not impacted by the Second World War in any meaningful way. We saw this massive surge of births, 3.8 kids per woman or something like this, depending on where you look, massive. And this surge of baby boomers changed everything. So we always count the first generation essentially as the baby boomers, and we count backwards, and we count into the future from there on.
Well, over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be working through each of those generations. Now, we actually must give respect for those people who even came before the baby boomers. So thank you for all these people who are following us, watching the videos on YouTube every week, listening to our podcasts on the favorite podcast app, because they're leaving comments. And somebody just left a comment the other day about, why don't you ever talk about the generation before the baby boomers? So we will give them some respect, because that was my grandparents, and I guess my parents as well. And well, some of those are still alive, neither of my parents, of course, but that generation. But we will work through each of those generations in the future. And there's some interesting insights I know you're going to give us. But today we're just, I guess, painting the picture. And one of the things you mentioned in your column in the New Daily, which we'll leave a link to in the show notes, was that generational research often gets misunderstood or misrepresented. What do you mean by that, Simon?
Well, so the idea is that it's just so open for stereotypes. And we then decide on certain kind of stereotypes, and we stick with them. Boomers are rich, old, and greedy, self-interested. Bam, done.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then the millennials, they are snowflakes who can't make a decision, and they should stop spending money on smashed avocado and finally settle down and buy a house. Something like this. These are the cliches that stick, and there's always a kernel of truth to it, so to speak. But that's not helpful, and that's what we want to steer away from. And of course, when we look at the generational markers, when I told you about the birth years that we assign to them, there is no such thing when we say the baby boomers start in 1950. 1946 and they end in 1963. It's not that this person who will be born in 1964 is markedly different from the person born a year beforehand. So these are sliding scales that we're talking about. And when we talk about values of a cohort, we talk about probability clouds. We say it's much more likely that when you're in this baby boomer cohort, you act this way, whereas if you're in this Gen X cohort, you act another way. And of course, we're talking about millions of people in each of those containers. So there is endless variety in those cohorts.
Well, we're going to be speaking about that in detail moving forward over the next month or so. Having said that, I think this is going to be really important for people to understand, as I said, what your employees are looking for in the job, what your bosses, your employers are looking for in employees, and how different generations can speak to each other in the workforce. So there's a whole lot of factors that we're going to draw in. Where do demographers get this information to make these assumptions, Simon?
Yes, so this is a big mix of data. So the sheer numerical data is easy. That is straight up from your National Statistic Bureau. You count the number of people in a birth year, and that's the size of the cohort. That is easy enough. On top of this, you need to add an awful lot of different societal data, value surveys go into this, and then of course consumer behavior, voter behavior. And you even then can take marketing material into mind. What kind of stuff works with which generation? And you throw all of those things together. So it's really a bit of a catchphrase, generational data, for all this sociological change over time. And it's an easy way of getting to the broad truth of the matter rather than the details.
Simon, what about culture in Australia? We're a multicultural society. We're very proud of it. It keeps changing. How do cultural and economic factors influence these generational differences?
Exactly. So it comes to when you think about when you grew up, there are certain kind of things just that seem to be true in the world, depending on that particular age that you grew up in. If you grew up in the Great Depression, in the 20s, between the world wars, things are tight. Holding on to belongings is absolutely crucial. You know that you cannot waste a thing. That is just a matter of fact. That is so true that it cannot even be debated to be true or not true 50, 60, 70, 80 years after the fact. When you're still alive, you still act that way. And so nowadays, of course, many people grew up in riches. If you think about the Millennials, so people born in the 80s and 90s, the kids of the baby boomers, they would have grown up in the households of baby boomers. So they, for example, are just used to material abundance.
Yes, interestingly, some very close friends of ours were born behind the Iron Curtain in Poland and actually very bravely escaped before that was allowed. And interestingly, while they're very wealthy, they still don't own a home. They've rented for a long time. And I've asked them why. And their parents taught them when they were young, 50, 60 years ago, because they're in their 70s now, that you can't trust the government and you always have to have a packed rucksack and some sturdy shoes packed ready to go to move. If that's the way you think, why would you put down roots? And Simon, to be honest, and I know Chris listens to this podcast, he knows who I'm talking about. Under their staircase, they have a packed rucksack and sturdy boots. This day, and it doesn't make sense in Australia, but that's been ingrained in them so long ago.
Exactly. And to a certain degree, these behaviors, if you quizzed your friends in a logical way, they could tell you, of course, there's a minimal chance this is a safe country. But there's a certain kind of, well, it's still just packing a backpack. It is a bit of a measure to give you peace of mind. It is, but it's your heritage. That is where you come from. If you look at the pantries of old Italian or Greek widows, they are packed like food supply could end tomorrow. And that, of course, makes no sense. Woolies, even throughout the pandemic, was stocked with the tomato pastes and whatever. So it's not per se necessary, but it is the upbringing. And certain behaviors just stick with you. And there's intergenerational conflict in this as well, because then if you grow old with your rucksack of behavior, so to speak, your kids, your grandkids can just look down upon you and go like, what the hell is the old man on about? Well, that's not the sign of the times anymore. And it is not. Yeah.
Just like my grandmother turned off the lights as she left the room because she lived through the Great Depression, and while in Europe and when coming here to Australia, she became wealthy, but some of those habits don't go. So how much of this is actually generational traits, and how much is really just the stage of your life you're at, lifestyle stages?
Oh, excellent question. Yeah, because we need to differentiate those things. So the life stage just means that we go through very predictable life stages. All the generations are being born, then they go to school, then they start a career, then they grow old, and then they die, roughly speaking. Yeah, and so the certain kind of life stages are always the same. We know that we live through them, and in those life stages, we roughly behave the same. But then we see that with generations, there are certain kind of life stages that just get stretched an awful lot, or that get shortened, depending on what you look at. And we also quite often talk about in generational research the long life approach. What that means is nowadays that we live much, much longer. We can, a person born nowadays can easily plan to live into their 90s. And so when you know that you have a longer runway, you can hang out in each stage of the life cycle for longer. So we now sometimes joke that adolescence is now a stage of the life cycle that begins when you're 13 and it ends in your mid-30s, which of course has to do with the definition of, hey, what is adulthood? And if you define adulthood as you become an adult when you take responsibility for somebody other than yourself, then that makes sense, because young people these days don't go to the military at scale where you literally fight for your comrade's life, but they also only don't start families until their mid to late 30s. So you can be an adolescent for longer. It doesn't mean that you don't have the physical markers of an adult, or that you don't draw an income, but there's slightly different behavior then, whether you have kids in your mid-20s or whether you don't have kids in your mid-20s. And that carries through as a generation. So that's the life stage that you live through. And then there of course just generational values. That means if you live through this life stage of having kids as a baby boomer, you did it slightly different than a cohort now. The issues might be minor, but they might be bigger.
Now, Simon, I know you advise businesses, policymakers, governments. How can they take advantage of this sort of information? Now, we're going to go into the different details in future episodes. So, by the way, if you like the idea of learning about this and you don't currently subscribe to the Demographics Decoded podcast on whatever podcast app you're at, just stop for a sec and just click the follow button. Or if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and click that little bell icon so you'll get a message each time a new show comes out. But I'm sorry, Simon, I asked you a question and then I interrupted you. But how can people get benefit from this? What can they learn from it? What can they do with it?
I think the most two obvious options why it is important to know about those generations is to know your customers and to know your staff, because this is human behavior. And you very much, obviously, whether this is a politician, whether this is a local government area, whether this is a business, you want to know roughly who your customers are. You want to know what they care about. It is crucial to know this. And of course, you have staff, and there is potential for intergenerational conflict, particularly this decade. Because roughly speaking, we tend to shift from one decade to the next by having either 3 or having 4 generations in the workforce. We're now in the middle of a decade that has 4 generations in the workforce. So boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z in the workforce at the same time. There is an elevated conflict potential, if you will. And so if you really understand what your colleagues, what your staff care about, where they came from, so to speak, you will be a better manager. You'll be a better leader, a better boss, a better employer. That's crucial.
Well, what are the primary sources of these intergenerational conflicts, Simon? Are they really generational, or are they more the fact that I'm at a different life stage of than a younger person, so I've got different economic conditions affecting me, different social ideas affecting me?
And the answer is definitely both. So there is the idea that just by the sheer fact of being older, of being more experienced in the most statistical sense, you tend to be richer. That shapes your worldview. But there's also just the idea about certain kind of behavior is different based on your stage of based on your generation. Baby boomers, for example, were this gigantic generation competing for a limited number of jobs. So they always think it is rare to find a job. It's a special thing to get a job. Then you need to hold on to this job. If you get the golden pin for 30-year employment with the organization, that is a marker of success. Along comes the young cohort of Gen Z who are entering the workforce right now. This is a tiny generation entering the world of work in times of super low unemployment, big job vacancies. Of course, those young people don't view the world through the same lens as baby boomers, because they flip the job interview. They ask questions from the employer, which drives the employer mad, and they think that this is just an entitled cohort, those young folks, and that's frustrating. And you see obvious conflict here that needn't be. Once you understand that the young people that are sitting opposite the table in a job interview now, that they just operate under a completely different set of leverage, why wouldn't they act that way?
It seems that different generations have got different work ethics, Simon, and also, I guess, different perceptions of entitlement too.
Yes, to a degree, but this is probably where we enter what you said before. How much of this is just one generation being old and the other generation being young? So we can go back to Roman times, when the old senators complained that the young senators are just entitled, lazy folks who have no idea, and so that is just age that's playing out. That is not generational stuff. You go, no, 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 no. I was very hardworking. I was not like this at all. And now it's the snowflakes coming along. Um, no, if you actually go through the archives and you look what each generation was described at the beginning, hardly ever is a generation being described as, oh wow, those guys are much better than we were. Finally, somebody's doing it right. There is just criticism. And this might be criticism from the perspective of with age comes wisdom, and we're criticizing the young idealists who are by definition always breaking with tradition. And the tradition, of course, was being established and upheld, at least the traditions that are still alive, by the old ones. And so that there's a natural conflict baked into the system.
Well, how much do media portrayals and social media affect how we see generational styles or these intergenerational conflicts, or is it just exaggerating the misunderstandings between the age groups?
Yeah, I think that it's exaggerating those stereotypes, and particularly funny is to me what happens to Gen X. So Gen X is, of course, this poor,
Who
forgotten
are they?
generation.
No one knows
Exactly
about them.
it. Yeah, it's the middle child of Australia, sandwiched between the two big generations, and so we always just forget about them and we skip them. And this is, if you look at memes, they're the generation that is even left out of memes, which is just hilarious because that in itself should be a meme. But so there's a stereotype there. And the stereotypes in the media, they are the okay boomer memes. This is just boomers being reactionary, old farts that are still sticking to their guns. They're hogging the empty homes. They're driving up house prices on the back of the young folks. Then you, of course, want to ask yourself the same question that you always ask yourself: is this categorization doing justice to the complexity of life? And obviously it isn't. But you see a kind of, you see at least hinting at a certain kind of societal discontent. Whereas then, of course, the young people are being described as those lazy snowflakes who don't really know how the world works, and so forth. And why would we trust them with power since they can't even manage to start families or build a house or whatever?
Well, I'm finding that one generation is often blamed for challenges faced by another. At the moment, it's environmental issues created by the baby boomers who didn't understand about the green effect and used up all the trees. Or maybe it's the cost of living now, or maybe the baby boomers have taken up all the good locations and houses, and so it's made it unaffordable for me. How do we get past the blame game? How do we work towards solutions that benefit all the
Yeah.
generations?
So I would argue that the generational data and narratives in its worst case are used almost like ad hominem attacks, when you just, instead of talking about politics, which is very difficult, you just say, this politician is a hero, this politician is a bastard, and you're done with it. That we're doing this then with just a generation. We say, well, all the past wrongs were the result of the old uns, evil, bad oldies. If we did this, which is partially true, of course, the status quo was established by the people that came before us. But then, if we do not at the same time put effort into acknowledging all the gifts that previous generations gave us, then we're clearly arriving at a very, very unbalanced view of the world, and that's not the goal of what that is. And you'll see this in the coming weeks, that I always try to insult and praise every generation. That's my goal.
Well, I'm really looking forward to that series. Now, if you're listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube and you would like to get Simon's wisdom for your company, your organization, or your business division, I'm going to leave a link to the demographics group in the show notes, and you can speak to Fiona, because, Simon, I know this is the sort of information that you've helped companies, organizations, government bodies with as well, to have a more harmonious workplace. But I'm really looking forward to breaking it down over the next 4 weeks as we go through the various generations. So I look forward to catching up with you again next week. And let's start off by digging into the baby boomers.
Digging in. You almost take the punchline away. Fantastic.
Okay, see you next week. Thanks, Simon. This Demographics Decoded podcast was brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property and wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. You can follow me on social media, but I suggest you also follow Simon Kirstenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all the social media platforms. I'll include links in the show notes. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Demographics Decoded podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. You'll be doing them a favour. I hope you will anyway, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to shape their future. And of course, any of the discussion we had today was not personal advice about your future, but just general information to help inform you.